What's up, everyone? Welcome to the 15th episode of Super Brain Radio, and our third protocol episode, which means we are summating Chapter 3, which was Endure, and all predicated on enduring change, regardless of what is changing, whether it's life, your physical skills and body, your intra- and interpersonal skills in the social world, or work and traversing the ladder of success. Change never feels linear, and there's a lot of cool physiology that goes along with what's happening in the trenches along the way. I think if we look at just from beginning to end and only talk in terms of outcomes, we lose a lot of the human aspect and a lot of the extra X factors, if you will, when it comes to traversing change. In every single good movie you can think of, there's this moment when you don't think the hero is going to make it, and what makes it awesome is that you believe that, man, the hero might actually not make it. Is this going to be a tragedy instead? And it turns out that they do make it. No one ever leaves home in search of barely making it. Everyone leaves home with a dream of doing something epic. And I think if you have a greater understanding of what's happening, whether the trenches for you last a couple of days, weeks, months, or years, you have a better grasp on what's actually changing in between your brain and your communication with the world around you, you're going to have a much better opportunity to either have a stronger shield and take less damage, or actually surmount the hurdles in front of you. So, in prior fashions with the protocol episodes, I've kind of paired episode 1 and episode 2 with episode 3 and episode 4, and when I was just looking at stuff today, it just didn't strike me that way. So we're actually pairing episodes 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. The pituitary gland and the amygdala are going to be what I summate first, and then intensification hormonal strategies are going to have their own synergistic comparison. And I think as I go through it, you guys are going to see what I mean a lot better, and I think it's just going to be cooler. And that's not to say this is how it's going to be next time, but I'm a big fan of doing things with proper confines, but within those confines being intuitive and flowy and understanding that every single one's going to be different. So just like if you have a bad customer service experience, like the other day I went to Chipotle, I got 2 burritos, and they were just trash, I didn't call in or do anything about it, but they were wrapped poorly. I got 4 small pieces of steak, and it looked like the rice was served by the hand of a toddler. And again, I didn't say anything, but if I was to call into Chipotle, I wouldn't be able to just call in and get on the phone with the head manager the second the phone gets picked up. I'd be sent to an automated menu first. Then after that, if I'm lucky, I can probably talk to a real person. And that real person is going to likely refer me to a supervisor or manager. So these kind of 3 batons passed I just mentioned are going to be the analogy we use today for the pituitary gland and the amygdala. That first opening menu is going to be your 5 senses, your metabolism, and basic interactions via the eyes and your hands and feet and all that stuff with the world around you. And they're directly going to relay you to the amygdala, and almost every time, whether it's the amygdala or someone else, they're going to get involved almost right away. The data that they collect is going to be handed off to the pituitary gland. And now it's funny because if any of you have heard the term a higher brain center before, I've been frustrated by what that means. I have been too. And it turns out that, yes, there is a top of the brain, a most superior part of the brain, and you could certainly argue that some clusters of neurons and sections of the brain are definitely stronger than others. But what we're really talking about when we talk about higher centers are who is the head boss, the head honcho in this scenario with reference to what we're speaking of. So higher learning centers when it comes to learning are different than higher brain centers when it comes to physical tasks. Totally different, and it would just be nice to know that, and I wish someone told me that earlier on, so here I am relaying it to you guys. But The pituitary gland is again going to be at the top. And if you go back to that episode, you heard me kind of talk about it as this social hormonal backbone. It has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe that do most of the social hormonal backing, and the medial portion of the lobe is pretty much just a liaison to facilitate the two from a protein and enzymatic standpoint, and the coined term there is intermedians in that medial lobe. But in the anterior lobe, we're mainly going to be dealing with the world around us via stress hormone starter kits, if you will, not the actual stress hormone itself, the backbone again, and our sex hormones. And these are going to be like secondary and maybe even tertiary moderators of behavior. It does not mean that by taking birth control, you're going to act significantly different, and that taking testosterone is going to make you act significantly different. Although you may feel different, it is not the primary contributor to why you may act different on them. So you can't blame them. They're higher up. It's like saying that it was the top-end supervisor at Chipotle that told those people to give me a toddler-sized wrap that was really wrapped like a taco instead of a burrito. But again, I'm not salty about it, right? But the point is, you can't blame someone who's not directly involved. For example, going back to that birth control or testosterone thing, if an increased amount of estradiol gives you altered carbohydrate function and metabolism to be more sensitive, and then that means that the lack of carbohydrates may give you a greater stress hormone response, and that influx of fatty acids and glucose into your blood via cortisol and norepinephrine makes you feel edgy and aggressive, and then you did something edgy and aggressive. And we can extrapolate that same vaguely hypothetical scenario for a testosterone usage, right? By altering the food kinematics, by altering electrical kinematics, by altering what's actually in your blood, it gave birth to an opportunity for you to behave different, but it certainly was not them. It is actually going to be the amygdala in that case. And again, if you go back to that episode, that's going to make sense as to why. But if we had to create an idea of what the amygdala is in a succinct term, it's safety. So it's easy to believe that safety influences your social hormonal backing, because we know that during the Great Depression, the average male testosterone value is roughly 5 times what it is today, and it changed very greatly prior, during, and after the Great Depression. And we also know that today's male testosterone values have been standardized for the last decade, more or less. And that's because life hasn't really changed much since 2012 to 2022 when it comes to, actually dying over food, when it comes to worrying about if you're going to have a home. Maybe times are tough for some people, but in the modern day era, we don't really need to worry about that stuff. So our social hormonal backing relative to safety is different. And that may beget the question, well, what kind of contributes to safety? Who's the answering menu here? It's going to be metabolism and your 5 senses, or kinesthetic awareness in a way. So kind of like with what I just said about that testosterone behavior and estradiol behavior thing, if you have altered function of how your body deals with large amounts of glucose or fatty acids at the same time, if your body can't resynthesize ATP or energy at rest when you're passive, whatever, it's going to secrete some type of stress-like response that does it for them. And then therefore, you may be feeling some type of impaired safety or increased feelings of vigilance due to that. The same way if, let's say, we gave you mittens and covered your feet with some type of shoe and sock that inhibited them from feeling, and put horse blinders on you, I promise to the zenith level, and I would bet every dollar in my pocket, you're going to have a panic attack within 3 days. And why is that? And it's because the lack of sensory information coming in from the world around you is going to cause an increase in your stress hormone responses as a gauge for trying to figure out what's going on in the world around you. And since that is inevitably not happening, those stress hormone responses are going to stay sustained just in case we need to respond to something in the world around us. So the biggest understanding and takeaway from the pituitary gland and the amygdala is that they have a relationship with other employees, if you will, and more importantly, that your social hormonal backing is almost entirely predicated on your interpretation of safety relative to the world around you. Now, we can easily start talking about tons of other stuff like meditation, acceptance. You could even talk about faith. You can talk about the lack of faith. Whatever it may be, safety is too big of an umbrella term for us to begin to tackle here. But you can absolutely say that an amygdala that's stimulated over time will impact the pituitary gland, the same way maybe we talked about an anterior cingulate or a frontal cortex that is chronically active over time will also impact the amygdala. Or the pituitary gland, excuse me. The point is, as things become either more chronic, more potent, more serious, whatever adjective you want to use, we start to climb that corporate ladder of success and recruit these higher centers. Now, kind of making a right-handed turn to the intensification hormonal strategy episodes. What we just talked about with the pituitary gland and the amygdala and their hierarchical relationship is insanely important here. And you may even want to go back and listen to some clips of some of these episodes, because when I talk about intensification being only that red hot portion of the sword analogy, and when I talk about hormonal strategies being this acute dual-edged sword for an opportunity to turn something into an adaptation long term, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And if you don't understand this kind of employer-employee management to, sub-management, I guess, relationship, then it makes it almost impossible to see between the weeds, because you're going to view everything with the same weight when that's in fact not true. So, before I talk about what nootropics really do and the 3 C's, it's important for me to introduce what I call the $1 approach. And this is creating habitual tasks around what you want to improve, whether it's before and after or during and after, whatever. There needs to be some type of red hot facilitation as some cool down facilitation. And you're going to take the minimum effective dose needed. Meaning, if it's just as simple as a little bit of mindfulness on a drive, or it can be as specific as taking a bunch of stuff and having a 30-minute chronic exercise routine right before you get on a phone call, whatever it is, you need to figure out what the minimum effective dose is, make the red hot and cool down portion synergistic, and most importantly, make it something that you can do with precision every single time without a doubt. The reason I call this the $1 approach is because you're really only messing with acute change. However, if acute change becomes chronic enough and has small enough variations, it's going to contribute to a piggy bank-like effect that is going to have anticipatory changes around the task you are referencing. And the reason that's important is because if you heard last week's episode, you'll really dig into and see how it's the fluxing, the moments right before, 30 minutes before, and leading into the task that really set you up to be able to learn. So now when I start to talk about what nootropics really do and what the 3 C's to facilitate them are, it's a lot easier to go back and look at how this is going to fit into your specific protocol and method. So let's start by briefly going over that sword analogy again and talking about what learning is. So you have this raw piece of steel or whatever you make a sword out of. You get it red hot, and you start hitting it with a hammer. And you can only hit it with a hammer so many times to shape it before it becomes brittle, but when it's the hottest is when it's the most malleable. But once you make change, you need to cool it down before you begin that process again. Wonderful analogy for learning. Excuse me. So nootropics are going to be antioxidants that impact specific brain areas that aid in that red hot approach. Now, antioxidant and free radical function is not at all the same in the brain as it is in the rest of your skin suit. In the brain, we actually need free radicals to oppose antioxidants, and the opposite, antioxidants to oppose free radicals at key times. If you have antioxidant function right before bed, guess who's not going to sleep? We need inhibition of key areas when it comes to the brain for learning to ensue as well. So, if there were never free radicals in your brain, that cooling process would never start. And we know the immune system is so important for the cooling process, and it's actually contraindicated by that red hot process. So it makes sense that nootropics have to be antioxidants. More importantly, they're going to give birth to what we call derived nootropic factors, typically coming from the brain, meaning BDNF, because there is something called GDNF that comes from a different cell in the brain, but that's not important right now. Nootropics are going to drive BDNF, which is the birthing opportunity for things to get red hot and to be receptive to what you're practicing. Now, it's not learning in a pill. You can't just pop some Noopept and then just start learning whatever's in front of you, although that's a better, option than not taking Noopept and trying to learn something. But the point is, there are three things that matter. 3 C's, as I'll call them. Creatine, cardio, and choline. We absolutely need some type of creatine fluxing, meaning the breaking down of it and then the recycling of it, to have the dopaminergic and system-wide portions of the brain that have to do with hormones active for you to make that red hot process real in the first place. We also need creatine cycling to stimulate the 5 senses in the hypothalamus, which sure will project onto the amygdala, and more importantly, give your metabolism and your brain an electrical platform for learning to actually happen. And if you don't have a platform to perform on, your performance is useless. And creatine is the essential most part of creating that learning-based platform. Next, when I mean cardio, it just is because I'm trying to find other C's, obviously. But what this really is, it's respiration and heart rate changing as appropriately needed, which I covered last week. So, if you're doing something that's heavy breathing with a high heart rate, the best cardiac hemodynamic, meaning blood movement platform, is maybe being a little bit cold, breathing through your nose, and having a low heart rate before you do it. It goes both ways as well. If you're doing something like chess that may be lower in heart rate and lower in respiration rate, might not be a bad idea to get yourself exercising beforehand. Lastly, we have choline, and choline is going to be the fuel in your car to actually get you to where you want to go. Sure, you have a car and you paid for car insurance, but if there's no gas in your car, guess who's not driving? So if we don't have enough raw electrical communication, then we can't actually get our brain to communicate with something somewhere else. And if there's no communication, we're also not getting red hot in the first place. So I kind of talked about the 3 C's as troubleshooting, but if we want to talk about enhancement, we're now going to start talking about, well, how do we sync this up properly with what you want to learn? So let's say you are a novice. I would not recommend taking anything or trying to learn anything in the introductory stages of something. Let it happen on its own. It's so brand new that your brain is going to do all these novel things to allow learning to happen on its own. Once you're a novice looking to become an intermediate, now we can start talking about enhancing learning and the experience related to it. So, simply put, let's say you want to get better at something and become an intermediate or progress to be a master. The same thing really applies. I would recommend at some point prior to the task, doesn't need to be right before, you do some kind of jumps or throws. Whether that's very simple box jumps, or you just walk outside and do a bunch of broad jumps. Or, I've done this with, some very well-respected athletes, go pick up a rock and just huck it. Along the way, pop some Noopept. Noopept is my favorite nootropic because it's non-stimulatory to the heart, it enhances articulation of speech as well as the 5 senses, it will lightly inhibit the amygdala, but not enough for it to matter in a sports performance environment, but more importantly, enough for you to be hyper aware without having inhibition of that awareness. And obviously, most important is volition, belief or desire, and faith in what you're doing. If you combine that creatine and cardio portion with the Noopept and that volition, you're setting up a perfect environment for your brain to be receptive to learning the task. Afterwards, make sure you start that cooling experience. So meditate and get some carbs in you. And make sure this is done under a low respiration, lower heart rate environment. And that's in simple $1 approach method right there. Let's say the task is golf. That's something that's prevalent in my life right now. And you're doing it around 1 p.m. Not a bad idea to do your jumps and throws anywhere from the 9 to 11 a.m. range. Take the Noopept afterwards with some food, and then start practicing golf in your head and watching some videos. Then go play, and afterwards meditate, practice acceptance, cool yourself down, and get some sugar in you to have this become a cyclic process and separate it from the rest of your day. If you're setting things up like that, it can be extrapolated to any skill really, and it can be as short as 10 minutes on either bookend, but you got to do something. Kind of related to learning, but not how everyone thinks about it. What if you want to do something you used to do? Something that you used to be good at, but you're no longer good at it. That is different than learning something new. Even though if we were to look at it from a brain perspective, it's all still technically learning stuff. The first thing you need to do in that restoration, we'll call it event, is you need to practice acceptance. And what I mean by that is clear your brain of all electricity and prior, connotations and associations with what you're doing. You're starting anew, at least for the time being. Then, acutely define what is excellence right here, right now. If you used to be just absolutely filthy at something, and it's been a bunch of years since you did it, you expect yourself to pick up those old tasks, those old standards, those old skills the same way, and you're immediately disappointed. That makes sense. So define what excellence is for you today in this acute moment. Then go out there and get yourself a win. Execute on what excellence is to you. Then, don't start picking speed up and doing it more often, or doing it better or harder, or whatever you think is going to be right. Make it subconscious. Let's say it costed you a ton of mental energy to go through that acceptance practice, and then excellence, execution, defining, and then the win. Next time, just do it and make it not so hard on yourself mentally, and get to a point that it's subconscious. And once you've kind of progressed past that initial block, if you will, of restoration, then you can worry about actually getting back to where you were, progressing past that, or even worrying about it at all. But prior, you can't worry about that. Now, these episodes I know are a little bit longer, but they seem to go by so much faster on my end, because summating all this stuff really does make it feel like a story to me, and I hope it does to you guys too.